Hello and welcome. Hang on one sec. I need to mute my microphone from there. There we go. Hello and welcome to Introduction to Web App Development, one of the last pre-CodeLabs workshops for 2019. Today we are going to be talking about how to make a web application, and that is going to be a little bit more complicated than just making some static HTML. So if you're the sort of person who's made something with just plain old HTML before, you haven't necessarily done anything where you have to, for example, have user profiles or allow reviews or anything that's sort of dynamic and changes like that, this is the workshop for you. So welcome. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to this. There we go. Cool. Before we actually get started in talking about how to how to actually code this sort of thing, I just want to review some of the basic concepts and talk about what a web request actually is. So before we go any further, if you don't know what HTML is, this is what HTML is. HTML is code that looks like this. It's got sort of this format of you got an opening tag and you got a closing tag. You got so open HTML, close HTML, open body, close body, open header 1, test page, and header 1, open p tag and p tag, p for paragraph. This sort of thing is a little beyond the scope of this workshop. If you haven't done any HTML before, that is something that you should learn yourself. It's not something that's easily conveyed in a workshop format. To be honest, a lot of the difficulty with HTML is just in the fact that it's not a very well-designed language and is kind of confusing. For example, why is a header called an H1? Why is it H1 through 6? Links are not called link, they're called href. There's a lot of things that are best learned by repetition. It's not a particularly complicated thing in many regards. It is complicated to make it look nice with something called CSS, which is also beyond the scope of this. A lot of HTML is just learning it and memorizing the common things and the common patterns. And again, it's not a well-designed language, but it's what we've been stuck with since 1991. So it's kind of, there have been some changes, but it's not changed as much as maybe a lot of us might have hoped. The other thing that I want to review is what's called a server. I don't actually know why the background for this is blue. No, it's blue. Server is what we're going to be talking about today. So if you've made a website before, you've put something online, you probably have heard of or thought of at least a server. It's a common thing that people think about when they think about websites. They think it's a server. A server is some magical looking box that sits on a rack and has lots of flashy lights, and it's in a data center and it's really loud. Traditionally, a lot of those things are true. So if you're making a web application nowadays, it's probably actually using a server that's sitting in a data center somewhere. And in fact, if you go to the SR&D website, some of our servers are in data centers. If you, we'll probably have a workshop later talking about how to do Docker. And if you want to use that and you want to use our test system, that will be on a test server as well. That is in an actual data center that's provided by a company called Greenhouse Data. It's in a fancy building in downtown Seattle, and it's got lots of flashy lights. But a server is not magic. What defines a server specifically is that it is a computer that has a single purpose, which is not to be used by a single person, basically. It's meant to be used by multiple people. So on a server, you won't see things that most traditional personal computers would have. So you typically see a monitor connected most of the time. Most of the time there are not monitors connected to servers because no one is actually using them physically there. There usually won't be a keyboard or a mouse. And so if you need to go and check something on your server, you will actually bring your own keyboard, mouse, and monitor and plug them all in. It's in a specific format, but it's not doing anything particularly more complicated or different than a personal computer. And the point of all of this is to say that even though you may not have one of these fancy flashy light servers sitting in a data center, your personal computer can be a server as well. And we will make it a server today. A server is a program that is sitting on a existing computer, and it provides some sort of service. Now, what is that service? I don't know. I mean, it's entirely up to you. There's no standard definition. Now, we are going to be making a website in here today, a web application. So we're going to be making a web service. And there's a few specifications for what is necessary for your web server service to talk to a web browser. But again, it could be anything. You could design your own. But it is just a program that is running on a computer, and it provides a service to clients. And programs themselves are really more the server than the actual machine that it's running on. Now, there are a few standards that we need to keep in mind. So again, I said that the actual concept of a server is very loose and undefined. One thing that isn't undefined is what's called a protocol. And this is something that is a standard that different things can talk. It's a way that different computers can talk to each other. So you can think of it as sort of like, I speak English, you speak English, we can communicate. Now, if I started speaking in like French or something, which I don't speak anyway, we wouldn't be able to communicate, right? If I started even using English words, but in a weird order, so I always put the verb at the start of the sentence, and then the nouns, and then the adjectives, and it's in the order of the words that they modify. Like, no one's going to understand what I'm talking about, right? A protocol is a way that we formally define basically what this English looks like for different computers. And for the web, that protocol is called HTTP. And you've probably seen that before, HTTP : / or something like HTTPS. HTTP is short for Hypertext Transport Protocol. And HTTPS is Hypertext Transport Protocol with Security. And that is a standard. It is not a complicated standard, and we'll talk about exactly what that looks like. But it is not a particularly complicated standard, and it's something that we can actually write in plain text ourselves, which is super, super neat. So what does HTTP look like? Well, HTTP looks like this. We make a request. You can see get /test.html http /1.1 host tyler.vc. And we get a response, which is this stuff up here, http /1.1 200 OK, content length 88, content type text/html, connection closed. So I can actually go ahead over here and clear this. And what I can do is I can run a program called Telnet. Let me go ahead and switch over to this a little bit bigger so you can see it better. Telnet example.com. And 80. So port 80 is going to be a thing that'll come up a lot. It's by definition, that's what it is. So we'll go ahead and look at this thing again. And what do we need to do? Well, we need to do get /. Now in this case, there's no test.html, so I'm just going to do get /http /1.1. And we'll do host example.com. And I'll hit enter twice. And you can see that it does literally return the HTML for that website. And you can see here's this http /1.1 200 OK. So if I were to go to example.com, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it. And I view page source, you can see here's this source code. Well, does that look familiar? It does, because it's actually the same source code from up here. Super, super neat. And the web browser is not doing anything different than we are. The web browser is literally opening a connection to that computer and is typing that text automatically, obviously. And then as a result of getting that text, the server is going to understand what that text is saying, and it's going to reply with the text in a certain thing. Because remember what we were talking about with protocols. That is what a protocol is a bunch of computers that agree on a specific way to talk, and this is the HTTP protocol. This get page thing, http /1.1, which tells it the version, and then host, and then the domain name. By the way, that's because originally the assumption was you would only ever want to run one website on a computer, so we sort of tacked on this host name afterward. Which is why it isn't just get tyler.vc /test.html. And then it responds back in this standardized format. And again, if we go back to this, you can see up here at the top, it's got this standardized format right up here, http /1.1 200 OK, a bunch of information like how long to cache it, what server was providing it, and some other things like that. And then it returns the HTML after 2 line breaks. Super, super simple, not that complicated. In fact, you may have seen this before, the so-called 404 file not found. That literally comes from the fact that over here, we literally have a thing that says 404 file not found. That is where that number comes. If you've ever seen 404 file not found, it comes from there. No magic involved whatsoever. This is something that you can manually do. If I were to go back here and I were to run that telnet again, get/test.html http/1.1 post example.com. Actually, it doesn't return a 404, which is kind of funny. Oh, no, it does. OK, here we go. Yeah, http/1.1 404 file not found. Super, super neat. So we can just type this text ourselves. It's nothing particularly complicated. Now, post request, if you've ever submitted a form, right? You've ever submitted a form. That is also a thing that is done on here. Hang on one sec really quick. I'm going to see if I can figure out why this is blue. Because it shouldn't be blue, and I feel like it's making it a little bit hard to read. Anything, color, document colors, custom. I don't know why these are blue. This is Linux. That's Linux for you. Okay, but in any case, post, hopefully you can see that because red on blue is not the best color scheme, but a post request is the same format, but the only thing is instead of hitting enter twice, we'd enter twice and then type in some other stuff, and then we hit enter again to actually send it. So we type some other things. And then if I want to redirect someone, 302 found, and then we add an extra header that says location. So all of these fancy things like doing a form or anything like that is not particularly complicated. It's not anything that is difficult to do. It's not anything that's difficult to code. All we need is a program that can speak this sort of language. So all a server does, and I really wish this was not blue. Let's do this. We'll make an actual blue thing. We'll make the color white, and we'll send it to the back. There we go. I don't know why the rest of them are blue. What the server does is it gets those requests, and if you have like a standard server, like if you've ever done an HTML web page, if you've ever made an HTML page, what the server does is it has its own configuration language, and it gets that request, it gets that, this part in green, and it gets that part in blue, and it looks up, as a program, it looks up what one has in its own configuration language, what one has this blue thing, and then it finds the folder associated with it, and then it checks if a web page is found, a file is found matching that thing, and it returns that HTML. That is what a web server fundamentally does. When you get an off-the-shelf one like Apache or Nginx, if you've ever downloaded a web server and you set one up, that's why you usually put an HTML file in a folder, because there is a program that does these things. It receives the request, it speaks HTTP, it looks up the folder associated with that request, and then it finds a file and it returns it. It speaks HTTP for you, so you don't have to, and you can make simple static HTML. But the thing is, there's no particular reason why the server needs to look up an actual file from the disk. All it needs to do is understand this and respond back, and you can make a program that receives text and does that. You can, in fact, even if you've never thought about networking, there is something that you've probably done in maybe a computer science class or something where you've read a file in a particular format. This is the same. You're effectively reading a file, except instead of a file, it's a network request in a particular format, and then you respond in a particular format, but you just need to write a function that does that. So files are absolutely not necessary. We can code it however we want as long as we speak HTTP. Now, what are some easy ways to do this? Well, Python and Django are what we're going to use, or are what most people are going to use. So Python and Django are super neat, easy to use. It sort of does a lot for you. This is what a lot of people use if you want to use Python. Now, there are different ones for different languages, so if you're more familiar with something like JavaScript, I'd recommend, you could use something like Next.js is a popular one, I think, using React. If you're more familiar with Java, there are Java frameworks. I would recommend against them because they're really complicated to set up. I would actually recommend learning Python over trying to set up a Java one, but you could. All of these different ones are, there are different possibilities, but if you're actually going to do something fairly serious for CodeLabs, I'd probably recommend learning Django. But what we're going to use today, that was the last slide, what we're going to use today instead of Python and Django is something a little bit simpler, just to sort of get that feeling for the fact that we're effectively making functions. Django and all these other frameworks will do a lot of magic for you, but fundamentally they're receiving text as input and understanding the format, parsing it is what we would usually say, and calling a function and returning a result. That is all that they are. So we're going to use a program instead that's called Flask. And Flask is a super neat one. Let's see if I can zoom in. There we go. Flask is a super neat one. It will still do a little bit of work for us. What the work that it is going to do is it's going to understand that HTTP format that we were talking about. But the thing that Flask won't do for us is all the other really fancy stuff that would take a while to learn. So that way you'll actually understand what HTTP is actually fundamentally doing. So what you need to do to get started with Flask on, we're going to go ahead and we'll get rid of some of this. To get started on Flask, this is all you need. You need a Python editor of some sort, which, by the way, if you don't have one, I would recommend PyCharm. It's a very general purpose, freely available. You can download a free version of it. There's a paid version, but there's a free version as well. PyCharm is a really good one, and it'll take care of all this stuff for you. It'll take care of installing modules and all of that sort of stuff. If you're on Mac, I believe that Python is built in. And if you're on Windows, you either need to install something like PyCharm, or you're going to need to do a lot of work to get it set up. You can find tutorials on that. I'm not going to go into it because it's very specific depending on what operating system you're using. But yeah, if you're using something like Map, what you would need to do is do something like pip install Flask. And if you're using something like PyCharm, there are ways of installing that as well. But what you would want to do is just search for how to install, a Python package on your operating system. Again, I'm not going to go into the specifics for every single one. If you don't have Flask, you'll get some errors about Flask is not found. So what we're going to need to do, we'll start from some more basic versions. This first line up here, you're going to need, it's import Flask from Flask. A little bit silly, but that's what we need to do is we need to tell Python that we're using Flask and that it's in the Flask package. The second thing we need to do is we need to create an app. And so what we're doing effectively is we are going to use that Flask that we imported, the capital F Flask. We're going to use that Flask, and we are going to go ahead and create a new app, and we need to give it a name. If we do __name __, Python will by default use the file name, which is kind of neat. Next thing we're going to need to do at the very bottom, we're going to need to say app.run. We can actually get rid of this for right now. If you need that, you'll find it online. But app.run, that's actually going to run the app. It needs to be at the bottom of the file. Now, in between, we're going to make a function. And this function is going to return something that we want to show on the screen. Now, in Python, you define functions with the def thing. We're going to give it a name. We'll call it index, parenthesis, and parentheses, colon. We'll just make it return some text. Now, in Flask, all of this, by the way, you can find on the Flask website. If you search for Flask Python, you can just find it. In Flask, the other thing we need to do is app.route/. Now, over here when we were in this presentation, we were talking about how it has this host name, which Flask is actually going to ignore for us right now. And it also has this file name, test.html. So if we wanted Flask to use test.html, all we need to do is that. I'm going to go ahead and save. And you can see app.route test.html, and what Python will do now, and Flask will do now, is run this index function whenever anyone goes to that page. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. I'll just type it out. Python.py is what I called my file. We'll click on the URL it gives us. And we'll add this /test.html. And we'll see that, if we zoom in a little bit, we'll see that Flask is actually, wrong scene. There we go. Flask is actually going to run that function for us. Now we named that /test.html, but if we name it just /, go ahead and save, restart our web server. We have to restart it. There's a way to make that automated, but I haven't set it up for this demo. See it now, just going to the web page with nothing else does actually return that hello world. If we wanted to make multiple pages, all we would need to do is give it another name. So let's call this one /last name. Def last name. And this is going to return my last name, which is Menezes. So if I go ahead and go back here, restart our server, go ahead and go back here and say last_name. Oops, sorry, no underscore in that, just in the function name. There you go, last name. I'm just going to say Menezes. Not necessarily the most useful page yet because it's just going to give you my last name. But let's start to talk about how we can use these functions, right? So you've probably seen this before, and I apologize, it's a little bit difficult to see the URL bar. I can type it out up here. But you'll often see something like this, test.com/last name, question mark, maybe first name equals Tyler, right? Or just name equals Tyler. We'll do something like that. This question mark part is what's called a query string, and we can access those in Flask as well. And by the way, whenever you're looking for something like this, you can just Google it, because programmers do pretty frequently is Google things. So I'll, for example, do a search for Flask, access query string. I apologize, I'm using Accordion. I usually use Dvorak. So my typing is a little bit complicated. But you can see Stack Overflow. If you've never been to this, is an amazing website. This is what you want to do. From Flask, import request. Another way to do that is, well, we'll do it this way. From Flask, import request. And what we want to do is request.args.get, and then the thing. So first name, make a variable, is equal to request.args.get. Just call his name. Now we have access to the first name that the user has requested, right? Which is neat, because we, rather than just returning a static string, can now start to do things that you can normally only do with functions. So let's up here outside of the function, or we can do it in the function. Just if you're not used to Python, maybe this will be a little bit more clear. Do names is equal to, and it's going to be what's called a hash map or an associative array, whatever you want to call it. If you're maybe not familiar with Python, I can do this in a different way, which is to say names Tyler is equal to Menezes names. Let's go with one of our new interns, Zeke, is equal to Eggerman. So now what we can do, instead of returning the static string, is we can return names and look up the first name provided. We'll see if this works. Hit the escape key properly. We'll go ahead and restart our server, see if it throws any errors. It doesn't, so that's a positive sign. So last name, question mark, name equals Tyler. We got an error. Now if we get an error, all we need to do is just come back, or what our error is. Global name request request. This should be a lowercase, so there's where our error is. Go ahead and restart this again. And we'll refresh. And there we go. So last name is Menezes, but if I change the first name to Zeke, it will say his last name is Egerman. So again, one of the things that we were talking about was on this this presentation how it doesn't need to be a static HTML file. There's no reason why when you're making a website it needs to be loading static HTML. Now something like Flask, what it's going to do for us is it's going to allow us to write this code so that we can map these functions. So for example, you can imagine how we would have a users page, and maybe that would load something from a database, which we can talk about, I think, in one of the workshops on the second week. We can load something from a database, right? And this function can actually go and load that, and then all of a sudden show a list of all users. And you can have a /users, and the reason that this is all working is because it's not a static HTML website that's being generated. What it is running a function every single time, which is super, super neat and super useful, I guess. So I'm going to go into some of the next steps that we need to get into here for like how you want to, how you would actually go about turning this into a useful product. We're not going to get too much into the in-depth of like how to do any one particular thing, so we're not going to make a login screen. We're not going to make anything like that. But I just want to give you some sort of tutorials on like where you would want to take this next. So again, we were talking about Python. Django, D-J-A-N-G-O, is a really good one if you're familiar with Python. A really, really good framework for creating websites. So we'll take a look at this real fast. And you can see Django makes it easier to build better web apps more quickly with less code. Now, obviously, this is not very helpful on its own. So what I would like to do instead, and to give you an example of how to do searches for things like this, here's a little bit slow. Python, Django, getting started tutorial. And we'll see what we can find here. Here we go, djangoproject.org/start. And then there's a tutorial here as well. So this is sort of, Django is the one that I would probably recommend to you if you're building an app in CodeLabs. It's going to be somewhat similar to that the Flask thing that we were just talking about, but it's going to make it a little bit easier to build larger web applications. There are a few features of it that are particularly useful that this will actually run you through. The big one is called templates. So if you have multiple pages and you want them to all look similar but have different information on them, Django will do that for you. Flask out of the box will not. But both of them are fundamentally just programs that are actually going to receive those web requests and are fundamentally just going to be taking those web requests and then doing stuff to them according to what you say, and then returning back HTML, which is super neat. Django is one that I would look into. If you're more familiar with Java, there are Java programs, but I don't think that any of them are particularly good. And if you're into JavaScript, there's a few different options for you. I think it's called Express.js. Go ahead and take a look at this. Here we go, Node.js, Web Application Framework. Express.js is the closest thing to Flask. It's going to make it very, very easy for you. Wow, this font is really thin, isn't it? It's going to make it really, really easy for you if you're familiar with JavaScript to go ahead and set up a web application there. You can see it's not very complicated. You get this res.send, which is what's actually sending the stuff. Let's go ahead and go back in this. There you go. Got this res.send, which is actually going ahead and sending the stuff. You got this app.listen, et cetera, et cetera. It's the closest equivalent. There's also another thing called next.js that's getting pretty popular for when you're doing more complicated web applications using something called React.js, which we're also not going to get into today. But if you're looking for something cool to learn over the summer, React.js is very popular right now. I think it was created originally by Facebook. I don't know if it's still maintained entirely by them, but it is a very, very popular framework for sort of creating really complicated web applications pretty easily. Again, there are Java ones, there are C# ones. Whatever language it is you're familiar with, there is a web server framework for it. But fundamentally, you could technically write your own. It's just going to be easier if you're using an existing one. So yeah, that would be my recommended next step, would be to go ahead and take a look at Django if you're familiar with Python, or Express if you're more familiar with JavaScript. If you're familiar with JavaScript only on websites and you haven't done much of it, I'd still recommend learning Django and Python over anything else. But once you've mastered the basics of this, this simple-looking Flask app, you can actually go ahead and you should be able to learn something a little bit more complicated, and I'd recommend Django for that. So with that in mind, this is the last workshop of the introductory series for CodeLabs. So again, CodeLabs officially starts next week. That's when our daily workshops start, and that's also when our mentor workshops start. If you need help with any of this in the meantime, though, and throughout CodeLabs, you can go ahead and join the chat, which is chat.srnd.org. And then the other thing last thing that I sort of recommend to you is go ahead and, if you're not already, follow us on Twitch, because all of these are going to be live streamed on Twitch, so you'll get notifications there. But we will also be sending out text message notifications for every workshop throughout CodeLabs, as well as the email notifications. So there's a lot of different ways to keep in touch. And if you're not sure about the schedule of CodeLabs, by the way, it is on srnd.org/codelabs/schedule. And that is also in your email. I forgot to transition over to that. There we go. But you can see the full schedule of all of the workshops that we have lined up for you for CodeLabs, as well as the mentor things. But fundamentally, CodeLabs is about building something, and so what we would encourage you to do is go ahead, get started, make something really cool, and if you need help, just ask in the chat, chat.srnd.org. Looking forward to talking with you all again next week and seeing what cool things you get started working on. So thank you very much for coming to this workshop.